Hey everybody, welcome into the podcast. This is Bob. I just want to take a second to talk to you about our friends at Radio Public. What's Radio Public? Radio Public is a podcast listening app that's free for you, and it earns your favorite podcasters, like us, money for their work. Radio Public is available anywhere in the world. It's easy to use, and it works on Apple and Android devices. If you're currently using another app to listen to podcasts, you can easily import your subscriptions into Radio Public. And the bonus for us is that as you listen on Radio Public, they pay podcasters like us. So the more you listen, the more you help out a podcast like ours. If you want to give back to Film and Whiskey, this is the way to do it. We know you might be listening on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, and that's great. But if you'll consider just pressing pause here, going over to your app store and downloading Radio Public, you can listen to us there. We'll be there waiting for you. So listen to Film and Whiskey on Radio Public, because when you listen to our show, everyone benefits. And now, let's get to the podcast.
In 1958, director Alfred Hitchcock and star James Stewart gave the world a chilling look into the human psyche.
In 2019, Heaven Hill tries to steal our hearts with a 92 proof bourbon.
The film is Vertigo.
The whiskey is Larceny.
And we'll review them both. This is the Film and Whiskey Podcast.
Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 1958 film Vertigo.
We're also beginning a new series with our whiskey reviews.
Oh yeah, that's right. In honor of our favorite whiskey to sip in the summertime, we're going to do 6 straight weeks of bourbon. So we're calling it
The Summer of Bourbon.
Summer of Bourbon. And we're going to kick it off today with one of our favorites, Larceny. We're also joined in studio by one of our favorite people. Returning again for her second co-hosting spot, we've got Jen Lowers. Jen, how are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the show again.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about this movie with you because this movie goes to some really weird, dark, psychological places. I know you're a horror movie fan, so I'm sure you're going to bring something cool to the table as we talk about Vertigo.
Yeah, moving on from $1 Million Baby, which has its own psychological weirdness, I'm really excited to go to this place with Jen, of all people.
So, Brad, this movie, Vertigo, has become an iconic film. And when it was first released, it was a flop. And Hitchcock actually pulled it out of circulation. And it wasn't until the 1980s when it was re-released that it came to be seen as a masterpiece. And among film scholars, this movie is tops in some regards. So there's actually, I know you've heard of the American Film Institute's 100 Best Movies list, but every 10 years, the British Film Institute does a poll in their magazine Sight and Sound. And they poll specifically, all they do is they poll film critics and film directors about the best movies in the world cinema of all time. And the last list that they released, Vertigo was the best movie of all time. It actually beat out Citizen Kane, which had held the #1 spot since the inception of this list. So we're talking about a movie today that is, the hype is real for this movie.
I think it plays into that cultural element you referred to before, Bob, where people at the time would walk in and out of movies kind of casually. I think that this is a movie that you really need to sit down and watch from start to end to really appreciate how good it is. And I think that's why it's withstanded the test of time.
Well, and going along with that too, Jen, right here at the top of the episode, we need to say that, you know, we always get into spoilers on our podcast. But with this film in particular, there are so many elements that I feel like if you haven't seen the movie, first of all, I don't want to ruin it for you, but I think you're going to be kind of lost as we jump back and forth talking about all the different things that happen in this movie. So please, if you need to see Vertigo and you need to pause us before you do that, hit pause, come back and listen to us after the movie, because you will be doing yourself a disservice if you listen to this before you've checked this movie out. So Brad and Jen, had you guys seen this movie prior to watching it for the podcast?
I had seen it, but it had been several years, so I was definitely excited to get the opportunity to watch it again. And I had a totally different reaction this time than I had years ago.
Yeah, so for me, I had seen this probably when I was like 16 to 18, like late high school years. And I am not ashamed to admit that as like a 17-year-old boy, I had nightmares about this movie.
Did you really? Nightmares?
Yeah, for real. I had like legitimate nightmares about this movie where like I was having the dream and I was like, what the heck is happening? This movie takes you to very strange psychological places, and it messes with the human psyche in ways that only Alfred Hitchcock could do.
Oh, definitely. I think it's, this time watching it again, I thought it was even creepier than the first time, honestly. And the first time I saw it, I was in middle school, so that surprised me.
Yeah, I think I saw this movie for the first time when I was in high school. And I mean, like, it's very clear that by the second half of the movie, Jimmy Stewart is like this hollowed out shell of a man who's just obsessed. So it's obvious that he's mentally unstable, but all of the places this movie goes with all of its characters are some like really dark recesses of the human mind. And before we get too far into talking about how dark this movie is, why don't we do our favorite segment, which is Brad Explains Vertigo.
So if you've ever seen Alfred Hitchcock, this would probably be considered one of his masterpieces. And Vertigo is a movie about a former detective who you actually see him why he quits. At the very start of the movie, he's chasing a bad guy and he almost falls off like a 5 to 7 story building. And a police officer that's working with him tries to save him, but the police officer ends up falling to his death. And it creates this pathological fear of heights known as acrophobia. Acrophobia is this fear of heights that's so severe you might just step up on a stepping stool and find yourself nauseous and dizzy. And this fear becomes the basis of an elaborate plot for a man, big spoiler alert here, to kill his wife. And so the essence of the movie is that this woman is possessed by the spirit of her ancestor to kill herself, and Jimmy Stewart is going to be the alibi to help a man get away with murder.
Yeah, so to clarify a little bit, if you haven't seen this movie, like the setup is just like Brad said. It's Jimmy Stewart having this fear of heights and having to quit the police force and then being recruited essentially by a guy he knew in college as a private detective to follow this guy's wife, who he says he believes is possessed by someone who's dead. And so this movie starts off in this really weird spot because you have these almost like these two competing narratives where it's like you've got the story of him having acrophobia that gives him vertigo. And then you've also got this weird supernatural thriller going on. And you're kind of wondering, how are these two things going to come to a head? And they really don't until like 2/3 of the way through the movie when Hitchcock reveals everything. Like he gives the ending away, essentially. And you find out that there is no supernatural element, that this was all an elaborate ruse to trick Jimmy Stewart basically into falling in love with this woman who is playing the guy's wife. It's an actress. This guy has basically already killed his wife, and he has set it up in such a way that he's going to dispose of the body by dumping it off of a bell tower. And knowing that Jimmy Stewart cannot chase this actress who's pretending to be possessed to the top of the bell tower, he's able to throw his wife's body off the top, leaving Jimmy Stewart's character crippled with guilt and regret and shame, and leaving him this crazy hollowed out shell of a man. And then where the movie goes after that is even crazier.
I love the fact that, as you pointed out, the movie 2/3 of the way through, when we find out that it's not supernatural, it switches genres. So first you think, okay, this is a supernatural movie, a thriller, mystery type thing. And then it switches. And then you find out that it's just sort of a crime, an elaborate crime movie.
The interesting thing for me is that the first 2/3 of the movie that we've dubbed the supernatural thriller, it plays so perfectly into and I'm guessing that most Americans feel this way, but I would say that most Americans, if you ask them like, are ghosts real? They'd be like, yeah, no, like ghosts aren't real. But if you got a few drinks in them and you asked them like, are ghosts real? They'd be like, well, they might be. Right. Like, I'm not going to say that they're not real. And the first 2/3 of this movie really play into that. Yeah, ghosts aren't real, but maybe they are.
Yeah.
And it really plays into that psychological underpinning so well.
Well, and as an audience member, you are in Jimmy Stewart's shoes, especially for those first 2/3 of the movie. And the way that he reacts to this supernatural ghost story that they're spinning for him is completely like incredulous. Like there's no such thing as ghosts. There's got to be an explanation for all this. And as you see him kind of start to believe it, you're leaning into that too. And I want to ask you guys about the structure of this movie, because like I said, it seems in those first 2/3 like there's two separate stories going on, and you don't know how his vertigo is going to come back into the picture with this supernatural weird romance that's going on. And then at the 2/3 point, it drops kind of both of those stories and becomes something completely different. And I don't know if that's a sign of a script that is just so brilliantly put together that you didn't see it coming, or if this script is kind of a hot mess. Like, I don't know what to think about the way this movie is structured. What do you guys think?
Yeah, the movie definitely changes. As Jen said, it turns into almost a different genre 2/3 of the way through. And I would agree, it's a really harsh shift. But the thing that I think ties the entire movie together is the suspense. And I said this to my friends that I was watching the movie with after they revealed that it was all a ruse and it was all just a plot to get away with murder. Why are you still so tense and nervous for the rest of the movie? Just as tense and nervous as you were for the first 2/3 of the movie.
I think it goes back to how you described this film when we first came into this episode, and it's that it's diving deep into the human psyche, and we're watching James Stewart's character slowly unravel over the course of the movie.
Absolutely. And I think it also gets into what is suspense. Like, Hitchcock went on record a number of times over his life describing what suspense is, and he always used this example of, like, you tell the audience something that the characters don't know. Like, he would always craft this story of, all right, imagine that there's two guys talking at a cafe, and in one of their briefcases is a bomb, and they don't know that the bomb's about to go off. Now, you tell the audience this bomb's going off in 5 minutes, and then you watch these people have an everyday conversation. And as an audience member, the tension is drawn in because you're clued into something that the characters aren't. And so that's kind of why this big reveal 2/3 of the way through the movie that this character, Judy, who's played by Kim Novak, is the same person as Madeline, who was who Jimmy Stewart thought he was following, also played by Kim Novak. And you find out that she was just an actress that was helping to move along this murder plot. It adds suspense because now you're clued in a place where Jimmy Stewart still has no idea what's going on.
By the way, the first time I saw that movie, I had absolutely no idea that was the same person when she changed her hair color. So when Hitchcock revealed that to us, he did it both visually and through cueing us into the audience into things that they didn't know. And so the letter writing scene is just so amazing because she's just kind of writing that letter and describing everything that you just said, but then crumbles it up and throws it away. So it's something that the audience knows, but that James Stewart's character just does not know.
Dearest Scotty, and so you found me. This is the moment that I dreaded and hoped for, wondering what I would say and do if I ever saw you again. I wanted so to see you again just once. Now I'll go and you can give up your search. I want you to have peace of mind. You've nothing to blame yourself for. You were the victim. I was the tool, and you were the victim of Gavin Elster's plan to murder his wife. He chose me to play the part because I looked like her, dressed me up like her. He was quite safe because she lived in the country and rarely came to town. Chose you to be the witness to a suicide. The Carlotta story was part real, part invented to make you testify that Madeline wanted to kill herself. He knew of your illness. He knew you'd never get up the stairs of the tower. He planned it so well, he made no mistakes. I made the mistake. I fell in love. That wasn't part of the plan.
Yeah, and I think the brilliant thing is, you genuinely don't know that Judy is Madeline until she writes the letter. The costuming department and the makeup department did such a good job with her hair. And like, literally, I was watching with my friends, and they said when they saw her, they were like, why would you ever do your bangs that way? Those look terrible. Yeah. And then when they reveal that she's actually Madeline, that's why they did the bangs that way.
Yeah, and like, this is a complete aside, but I had such a huge problem with the way that they did the Judy character's eyebrows, because they had that fake, like, Instagram painted on effect. And I'm like, oh, these look terrible. But it plays into this idea that she's trying to kind of hide behind makeup now and make herself look different, than she did before when she was Madeline.
And this all leads you to what probably is my favorite moment of the movie, when he is turning her into Madeline. He's making her get the same gray pantsuit. He's making her get her hair colored blonde. And then when she finally goes into the bathroom and changes her hair so that it looks exactly like how Madeline did it, and she comes out of the bathroom and there's that like effervescent glow, and she walks out as if she's walking out of the grave, that moment is so rewarding and chilling.
I love how Hitchcock uses color in this movie to convey emotions, but also to tell the story. And at that point, the color that was used, it was kind of like blue, and it really made her look very ghost-like.
Yeah, it was this really eerie, almost greenish color. And Hitch used, like, the two dominant colors in this movie are red and green. And I think the more I watch it, the more I think that red is, it's the color of desire, but it's the color of things that haven't happened yet. Like the walls in the restaurant were red because she was like the object of what he was chasing. And I think his front door is red, like because they hadn't actually kissed and, had sex yet. Jimmy Stewart and
even though she was naked in his bed.
I actually read the red totally differently.
Oh, let's hear it. Yeah.
I felt like as a woman, it was kind of a depiction of her anxiety in those situations.
Oh, interesting.
I felt like he was really creepy in a lot of those situations, and it was very clear he wanted to change her hair and the way she did things and change her outfit, that he was thinking about another woman.
Yeah.
And I just thought a lot of the things he says are super creepy, and the red really kind of showcased her anxiety.
Oh,
in
that's
a visual
interesting.
way.
See, because that's kind of how I read the dominant green, because the green seems to come up in situations where they're dealing with the past. So like when he first meets her in the restaurant, she's wearing this green dress because she's portraying someone who's possessed by someone that's dead. And like when she comes out of, in the last half of the movie, James Stewart meets this character, Judy, who he doesn't know is the same person, but he is so obsessed with the image of this woman that he's lost to what he thinks is a suicide that he tries to obsessively make her over. And like Brad said, when he finally succeeds in making her look exactly like his lost love, she comes out of this room and into his presence, and it's in this weird green glow where it looks like she's literally emerging from the past, from the dead. So we've spent a ton of time talking about the plot details of this movie, and I hope that you guys listening have seen the movie, because otherwise you're just as lost as we were when we were watching it. So let's pause here for a second, and I just want to talk about the performances in the movie, specifically Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak, because it really is their movie. Like there's a couple periphery characters, but for the most part, I mean, it's Jimmy Stewart and it's Kim Novak. So let's start with Jimmy Stewart. What did you think of his performance? And I know Jen's kind of talked a little bit about the creepy factor of like what the character goes through, but specifically, like, how do you think his portrayal of that was done?
I think that with Jimmy Stewart in this movie, you get him in a really interesting place where he is so unsure of himself that you see him desperately grasping for answers in a realm that he doesn't understand. When you think about a detective, detectives in general would be people who are very grounded in reality and what happened at the crime scene to help me prove that the bad guy did it so we can get them convicted. You know what I mean? They're very grounded in the real things of the world. And so what you see somebody who's floundering, who's saying, okay, well, what if it's true that she's possessed by the spirit of a dead person? I don't know how to deal with that. That's out of my frame of reference. And so he's just floundering throughout the first throughout the entire movie of this is something that's so far out of my wheelhouse. I don't know what to do. And he does come across as really creepy in a lot of different scenes.
I love the way that his facial expressions really are what captures the creepiness. That was the creepiest part to me, was seeing his reaction to her come out in that dress with the hair done exactly like he wanted it to be done. He just looked like so excited about it, and it was really weird.
It's almost like a release of just like, I can live in the past now, which is a weird place to be because as humans, we would generally say we shouldn't live in the past.
I've been sitting here listening to you guys, and I think that part of the reason that Jimmy Stewart comes across as so creepy in this movie, I mean, obviously he's doing things in making over an unwilling participant kind of to look like someone else that is just generally creepy behavior. But I think the other part of it is that he's presented as the protagonist in the first 2/3 of the movie. And not only is he the protagonist, but like we're in his shoes. Like he is the conduit for the audience. And so to watch this person who is so like presented as like being a healthy skeptic, there is no supernatural, there is no afterlife, things like that. To watch him become this obsessive, possessive person, it implicates us in it in a way. And I think that's what makes it so skin-crawlingly creepy, is that Hitchcock's basically saying, like, this could be any of us. We all have these super dark recesses in our minds that can take over at any point. And that's what makes the movie so unsettling to me.
So one of the things I liked about what you just said about the creepy factor of this movie is that Hitchcock showcases things about Jimmy Stewart's character early in the movie that kind of get exacerbated as his mental illness progresses. For example, he was always kind of controlling. We see that even with Midge, his ex-fiance. So he's at her apartment saying, "Oh, come on, Midge, let's go out. Why don't you put on a hat?" Well, I'd be like, why are you telling me to put on a hat? That's really weird. So he was always a bit trying to control women, but then that sort of got exacerbated later as his psyche sort of started unraveling throughout the movie.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The interesting thing for me is that during Judy's time, when Kim Novak is Madeline, she almost plays into it and encourages those behaviors, especially when you look at the scene where he saved her from the water and he took her back to his house. And you even think about that scene, why didn't he take her to a hospital? Because he wanted to be in control of the situation. He knew, in his mind, well, I know what to do. I can help her in a way that is fine. She doesn't need other people's help. She needs my help. And so you see kind of a control factor with that.
Definitely. And that is something about that character that happens throughout the whole movie, is that he's not only trying to control situations and other people, but he also is under the belief that he can cure his own mental illness and hers.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, like circling back around a little bit, is, I mean, there's characteristics in all of our personalities that are, negative characteristics, and Jimmy Stewart's character is the kind of person who just kind of seems like a generally controlling person. But in the early scenes, it's presented as kind of an innocuous thing, like, a sort of innocent thing about his personality that might be a blind spot. And I think what Hitchcock is doing in this movie is he's telling us basically, no, all of those things in our personalities that are kind of negatives can get taken to an extreme where it becomes the only thing that's in control of us.
I think that's even why he lives alone. And he even comments on that at one point in the film. He says, well, some people prefer to live alone. I think that plays into exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, for me, I will say, as a little bit of a counterpoint, I think that some of those things, like the controlling aspects that you said of like, well, put on a hat and we'll go out. Like, there's a part of that is controlling, but when you're in relationship with somebody and you know the person, when you're loved and accepted despite some of those flaws, it's one of those things where if he had said that to a random girl that he just started dating, she might not take it very well. But like Midge knows him super well. She clearly loves him and cares for him. And so in relationship and in community, that flaw isn't necessarily a flaw. It's just kind of a part of who he is. And Midge is okay with that. But like you said, as his psyche begins to deteriorate, it becomes extremely unhealthy.
I got the impression that he didn't want to be with Midge anymore because she wouldn't let him control her. So she was like, no, I'm not going to wear a hat. Whereas Madeline would have been like, oh, absolutely, I'll put that hat on.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of segues us into talking about Kim Novak, because this is the kind of performance where, in her early scenes as Madeline, there's no dialogue. And she's telling everything through this performance of pretending to be possessed. And when she finally gets dialogue, she's speaking in this very affected way. Like she puts on airs. She sounds like an aristocrat as Madeline. And then as Judy, she's this really blue-collar, down-to-earth girl, kind of snarky. But the places emotionally where this movie makes Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak go, this movie is an emotional roller coaster because you're in the psyches of these people who are double-crossing each other and falling in love and not wanting to fall in love and thinking that someone's dead. And I was so impressed this time around with Kim Novak's character and her performance in this movie. And I think part of the reason I was so impressed is that when you get to that 2/3 point and Judy writes this letter confessing that she actually helped this guy, Gavin Elster, murder his wife, she kind of becomes the protagonist of the film after that because you know her secret. And when Jimmy Stewart snaps and figures out the mystery at the end of the film, you understand his motives. You understand why he's so upset, and he is kind of like throwing her around in a violent way. And yet, the creepy thing about it is that we're sympathizing with her in that situation just as much as him because we know her regret for what she did. We know her secret. And so Hitch puts us in the shoes of basically a killer and makes us have sympathy for that person.
Yeah, maybe not a killer herself, but an accomplice to murder. And I think the interesting thing about Kim Novak's character is that, as Jen said earlier, the early character of Madeline is literally a fabricated character that her entire purpose is to seduce Jimmy Stewart, to seduce Scotty. And so when you look at her, you realize that, yeah, all she was about was drawing him in, giving him power, giving him the ability to think that, she's possessed by a dead person by drawing him in. Whereas the later character is a real human being who wants to be seen and known and loved for herself. Just the way that Midge loved Scotty for himself. She loved him for who he was, even though there's some negative aspects. Judy wanted to be loved for herself, but she realized the only way that I can be loved by him is to become Madeline again.
Yeah, and this movie gets into some really interesting theses, I guess, about like, what does it mean to love your imagination's idea of a person? What does it mean to be in love with like a figment of someone as opposed to a real person? And the danger of reliving the past. It gets into these really interesting, we keep using the word psychological, but it really does delve into human regret and guilt and memory in a way that it plays on your mind. This movie is kind of, for lack of a better word, like a mind effer. Like it really is. Like, and especially for being made in 1958, I still can't believe that this movie got produced, got a wide release, was directed by someone like Alfred Hitchcock, because it's still as effectively creepy and unsettling 60 years later.
You know what's something that I'm not surprised got produced though, Bob? Larceny Bourbon.
Yeah, I'm super excited to try this Larceny. What do you guys say we pop the cork and give it a try? All right, so here we are drinking Larceny Bourbon. Larceny is made by Heaven Hill. It is bottled at 92 proof, meaning 46% alcohol. On Heaven Hill's website, it says that Larceny is 6 years old, which should give it some nice, good, dark, toasted barrel flavor.
That's a well-aged bourbon.
Larceny is a wheated bourbon, so meaning that wheat is the second highest used grain in the mash bill. So obviously you've got corn at 51% and then wheat. And, wheat is used generally to smooth out the taste of bourbon so that you don't get those harsh kind of rye tones. What are you guys picking up on the nose of this Larceny?
I love it personally. I think it smells great.
I can smell in a healthy way. It almost has that sweet corn type of nose to it. Yeah, it has like a sweet creamed corn type of smell to it that I'm really enjoying.
Yeah, I'm definitely picking that up as well. Although I am a little surprised that I'm getting some kind of more sour, bitter notes on the nose as well, especially since they're hyping it up so much as being like a really smooth bourbon. I don't know if this is going to be as sweet as I was expecting it to be. So, Brad, if you had to give it a score, what would you give it on the nose?
I'm going to give it a 7 on the nose. I'm really enjoying this nostril infusion.
Jen, what would you say that you would score this out of 10 on the nose?
I'm going to give it an 8. I think it's really pleasant, and I could see myself even getting bored and swishing it around and sniffing it for a minute or two.
Yeah. It does have those nice sweet corn notes to it, but there's something about those sour notes that I'm picking up that's really not doing it for me. I'm going to give it a 5.5 on the nose. Hopefully the taste is better. Why don't we take a taste now? So I'll say, having just tasted it, that it doesn't do a lot in my mouth. Like, it's pretty straightforward. It's a thinner mouthfeel. It catches you with a burn right on the back of the tongue. You do get some sweet notes, but that wheat is really doing its job in terms of toning down everything in the bourbon. And my fear is that it's not just toning down the spicy notes, but it's also toning down a lot of the sweetness too.
If I had to summarize everything Bob just said, he's basically saying it's not viscous enough for him.
It's not viscous, but it's not just a super complex bourbon. Jen, what do you think?
I agree with you, Bob. I think that the burn overpowers a lot of the flavors that would otherwise be really pleasant to have kind of lingering. Mm-hmm. So I would kind of cite that as a negative.
Yeah, I agree. Guys, what do you think you'd score this out to? How about you, Brad?
I'm not actually getting the burn that you guys are saying. I actually enjoy this. It's not the best bourbon I've ever tasted, but I think it has a sweet smoothness to it that I'm enjoying. I'm going to give it a 7.
Yeah, when I say burn, I'm not saying that it's like a alcohol all the way through singeing my mouth kind of thing. You just get a little bit of that kick at the back of your mouth right before you swallow for the finish. I'm not wowed by the taste on this either, and I'm kind of bummed because I really wanted to like this a lot, but I think I'm just going to give this one another 5.5 on the taste. Jen, how about you?
I think you're right that this is not a strong burn, but I do think that it definitely has just a little bit of one. I personally like the flavor of the aftertaste a lot, though. So out of 10, I would give this one a 7.
All right, so let's talk about that finish then. For me, it had a little bit of an ethanol burn to it. It wasn't spicy though. And so all the burn you get is the burn that's coming from the alcohol. It didn't really linger in my mouth on my palate, but it certainly warms you going down, as they say. So if I had to score this out, I would probably give this a 6 on the finish. Brad, tell me about the finish and what you would give it.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned the bitterness at the start of the nose, I'm kind of getting that on the finish here a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a 6 as well. The finish is just okay.
Yeah, I'd give the finish a 7. I think it's pretty good, but not the best I've ever had.
All right, and then overall balance. I just kind of found this to be an unimpressive bourbon. Not bad, but I just wasn't wowed by any particular part of it. I would probably say out of a 10, I'd give it a 6 on the balance.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give it the same thing. A 6 comes to represent just a barely above average score. So I'm just okay with it.
I'd give this category a 5, personally. I don't think it was well balanced because it was just an inconsistent tasting, I guess.
For sure.
Hey everybody, it's Bob. I just want to check in real quick to tell you about another giveaway we're doing on our Instagram page. Now, we just gave away a bottle of Weller Antique 2 weeks ago. This week, we're actually going local. So we did an interview with a distillery here in Ohio called Red Eagle Distillery. It was going to be one of our My Favorite Movie bonus episodes. It ended up that the audio wasn't quite up to the quality that we're used to, and we didn't want to put it out there with bad quality audio. So what we're going to do instead is we want to drum up some support for Red Eagle by giving away the bottle of bourbon that they gave us at our visit there. So if you head over to our Instagram page, you will see instructions on how to enter the giveaway. You need to follow our page, you need to click like on the post, and you need a code word. And that code word is Buckeye. That's right, Buckeye, as in the state of Ohio, Buckeye. So that's the code word you need. If you want to enter the giveaway, head on over to our Instagram page, give us a follow, give us a like, and don't forget that code word. Now, let's get back to the show. All right, so our last category is value. Now, in the state of Ohio, a fifth of Larceny is going to run you $26.99. So we are firmly into that tier of, I would say the $25 to $40 mid-shelf bourbons. Jen was actually gracious enough to buy us this bottle of bourbon. So having paid for it, how do you think this stacks up in terms of its value?
I think it's a good value. I've definitely paid at least a little bit more money for a lot worse of a bourbon.
Yeah, for me, I would say I was thinking that this was a $30 to $35 bourbon. And at that price range, I would say, no, this is not a good value. For $25 to $28, this is a solid bourbon. You're approaching those mid-range bourbons. In a few weeks, I think we're going to try Henry McKenna. And from what I've heard, that's a few dollars more, but that is approaching this is a solid mid-range bourbon that you would give to anybody. Larceny is approaching that level. And I think the price point reflects that. So I would say that this is actually pretty good value. I would probably give it a 8 on value.
I agree with you, Brad, on the value. I would also give it an 8. I think it's a good value for a bourbon, and I would probably even give it as a gift to someone.
An 8 on value. Okay, I am realizing the more that we drink whiskeys, that especially bourbons, that you kind of just find a mash bill that works for you. And I really like sweeter bourbons. And this one didn't have the sweetness and the complexity that I really like. And I think that there's probably a couple bourbons in this price category that I would rather pay $2 or $3 more to have. But that doesn't mean this is a bad value. If the mash bill on this bourbon is up your alley, then this is still $26, $27 is not a bad price at all. Last month we had Elijah Craig. I would probably say that I'd put Elijah Craig above this in terms of my enjoyment of it. But for the same price point, I don't think it's a bad value. I'm going to go ahead and give it a 7 on value, which puts me out to a 30 out of 50, firmly in that 60th percentile. Brad, what are you coming out to on your overall score?
I came out to a 34.
34? Ah, that's pretty good. All right, and Jen, how about you? What did you come out to?
I came out to a 34.
So I'm a little outnumbered here. I think maybe I've undervalued this one a little bit. If we average out my score and Brad's score, we're at a 32 out of 50. So it's almost in that top 2/3. It's a solid bourbon. I don't know if I'd have it on my shelf, but I would probably still recommend it if you like the flavor of a bourbon like this. Brad, would you recommend?
I would definitely recommend. I think that this is one of those bourbons that, honestly, it has good marketing. The packaging looks really neat. It comes in a cool bottle. I think it looks good on the shelf, and it's something that I would be more than happy to serve to friends at a gathering.
Me too. I think it looks cool, and it also has a cool name. I mean, you can't go wrong with Larceny.
Stealing things is always a good idea.
I think you can't go wrong with Larceny should be the new slogan of this brand. And I also think that you can't go wrong with Vertigo. So what do you guys say that we get back into talking about Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece, Vertigo? So that was Larceny Bourbon. Let's get back into talking about Vertigo. This movie, like we could go in 15 different directions with this conversation, and we haven't even really talked about Alfred Hitchcock as a director. I mean, we're talking about one of cinema's most revered, respected directors. The French New Wave people would study his movies frame by frame. What do you see in this movie, Brad and Jen, that Hitchcock does that no one else can really do?
I think that Hitchcock, and you said it earlier, in how he is able to draw the audience into the movie in ways that feels like you're getting inside information. He has this way of giving you information about the movie that the characters in the movie don't know, where you as the audience member are like, oh my gosh, like I know what's going to happen, but I'm not sure exactly how it's going to come about, and I'm nervous about everything that's happening in the movie. He just has this brilliant manner of treating the audience members as a part of the movie. I think that that's something that a lot of directors don't understand, is that your audience members are literally the most important part of the movie because they're the one paying you money to watch what you've put out. And he just has this way of treating the audience members as a part of the movie that is brilliant.
I love the letter writing scene where she sits down and she's just writing that letter, and it's just to us. And I think that's the point that you're making, is that she crumbles that letter up, she throws it away, and that solidifies in the mind of the audience that this is just information we're getting. That character will never read that letter. And that's just a really cool moment provided to us by Hitchcock, and he does a really good job of that in this movie in particular. I think that's why it's one of his masterpieces.
But at the same time, like he does stuff to serve the audience, but he also implicates us, like as audience members. We talked about this a little bit in the first half, how Hitch is showing us, I say Hitch like I'm best friends with him. Hitchcock is showing us, like through Jimmy Stewart's character, that we are him and that we can get to that point just the same way he did. But he does these nice little directorial flourishes even from the beginning. I think at this point in his career, Hitchcock knows he's the master of suspense, and he knows what an audience is expecting when they go into a Hitchcock movie. And so we kind of start to see him play with form a little bit. Like we see this opening where a guy falls off a roof and it's like traumatic. And then we fade back in on Jimmy Stewart and he's just kind of clowning around with his cane in the aftermath of it. And there's this sense of like, what meaning did that first scene have? And then by the end of the second scene where he's in Midge's apartment, he decides to climb up on a stepladder to prove that he doesn't have acrophobia or vertigo. And Hitch does this amazing thing where like he's climbing each step of the stepladder and it cuts to Jimmy Stewart's face and his reaction. But then it cuts right back to his feet, and he takes these slow steps in close-up, and there's no music behind it, and there's just kind of the sound of traffic in the distant street. And even in that little scene, Hitch is building suspense like crazy. Like you feel as he's climbing a 3-foot stepladder that something bad is about to happen.
Can I just say for a second, poor Midge. I absolutely love Midge. She's loving and supportive, and the moment that really gives her humanity is when she paints the picture of herself from the portrait of the dead woman that is supposedly possessing Madeline, but she paints herself in it in this like kind of playful, coy attempt to be like, hey, like I can be the object of your affection. Poor Midge. She just wants to love on Jimmy Stewart.
But I also think that Hitchcock used her as a way to showcase that anybody can have an obsession with someone, and maybe obsessions can have a healthy level and an unhealthy level. Because, like, for example, she follows him to see what he's up to and finds that he's with Madeline.
Yeah, so she's just as guilty of it as he is in some way, even though she handles it in a more healthy way. I actually want to go in on that scene a little bit because Midge finds that Madeline has been in Jimmy Stewart's house and sees that, or in his apartment, whatever, and she sees them from the street. And that whole sequence where Madeline finally starts having dialogue and talks to Jimmy Stewart, and you can tell that the character of Madeline, who we find out is Judy playing a character, really is actually falling for Jimmy Stewart. And like the sexual tension is crazy. Like she comes back the next day to drop off a letter, and they have this unspoken thing going on because she's a married woman.
Where are you going?
Oh, I don't know.
Shopping?
No.
Well, anywhere in particular?
No, I just thought that I'd wander.
Oh, that's what I was going to do.
Oh, yes, that's right. I forgot. It's your occupation, isn't it?
Yeah, well, don't you think it's kind of a waste for the two of us
To wander separately.
Uh-huh.
Only one is a wanderer. The two together are always going somewhere.
No, I don't think that's necessarily true.
You left a door open.
Be right back.
And the next scene you see they're in the same car together, like driving to the redwood forest. And there's this sense of dread because in old movies, you don't have an affair. Like someone's about to die if you violate the sanctity of marriage, right? And so they're driving down the coast together, basically, or driving into the forest. And you have this sense that like what they're doing is very wrong. And why is Jimmy Stewart letting himself go to this place? And it tips you off to like the dark psychological places that this movie is about to go.
Yeah, the Sequoia Redwood Forest scene stood out to me as one of the weirder scenes of the movie in the sense that like I didn't totally know why it was there. And that's there's certain things about this movie that I can say I didn't care for. And I will say, as much as I love the almost like 15 to 20 minute silent scene where he's following her around, it's brutal. It's really slow paced. It's really slow moving. But then you move into the point where they actually have conversation. And I think that the apartment scene is interesting for a lot of different reasons. But I get to the Sequoia Redwood scene and I don't really know what they're doing there, or like, why did they go to see the redwoods? Like, was that a place that she went when she was supposedly possessed by the ghost? I couldn't figure that out.
Yeah, my sense was that Jimmy Stewart's character motivation at that point is I'm going to help her prove that this is not someone possessing her, that she's been to these places and that she's just having some weird malfunctioning in her brain. And so they go to the Sequoia forest because he's trying to show her that there's a rational explanation for everything. And that's why the movie, it ends up existing in like 5 different genres, because at this point of the movie, you think that it's this man and this woman who are falling in love and they're solving a mystery together because he's trying to put these pieces together. And so as an audience member, not knowing what comes next, you're like, oh, they're going to figure out a mystery. And then she dies. And you're like, what? Where's this movie going from here?
A lot of movies combine genres. For example, Cowboys and Aliens is both a Western and a sci-fi film. But Alfred Hitchcock is so brilliant in his direction because he switches from one genre to the next without the audience members really suspecting it's going to happen. So it's not only a multi-genre film, but it's also one that switches from one to the next unexpectedly.
And I think the cool thing about those switches is that he always keeps the genre of suspense as the foundation. You know what I mean? Like, he's building a house that's going to collapse on itself, and it has different genres like crime solving and all these things we're saying. But the foundation of the house that is present in all of those things is, holy crap, what's going to happen next? That is the essence of suspense, is I think things are going to turn out a certain way, but I am not sure that they will. What is going to happen next? And that is the underlying foundation of this entire movie that makes it feel creepy throughout. That even when we think it's a murder even when we think it's, you know, two people trying to solve a mystery together, I'm still creeped out by what's happening.
So we're going to have to get into our final analysis here in a minute, but I don't think we can go any further without at least mentioning that Hitchcock is not alone in helping to craft suspense, because this movie has one of the best scores in cinema history from Bernard Herrmann. Did you guys, I mean, it's so famous that I'm sure you guys have heard clips from it before, but what did you guys think of the way that the music and the score was used in the film?
Usually, for me, a thriller suspense film, tends to stick to the same type of music throughout and just sort of uses it to build suspense. However, Bernard Herrmann really used the music in a way that showcased a wide range of human emotions that he was going through throughout the whole film.
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing about the music in this movie is that you never recognize that it's there. It's so soft and it underpins the movie and it kind of girds it with this reality that it's one of those movies where you're like, I didn't even notice that it was there, but it was perfect and it fit the mood every single time.
And one of the best instances of the score is Jimmy Stewart's nightmare sequence. And I know that we've all been super excited to talk about that sequence, but Jen, you were especially pumped that Hitchcock brought in elements of animation into that sequence.
At that time, animation was predominantly seen in Disney films and films intended for children or whole families to watch. So it was even creepier to me that this would be used in a way to build suspense and kind of terrify the audience.
Yeah, if you look at one of the most common elements of horror, oftentimes directors will take something that is meant to be a children's object and is instead used as an object of horror. Think about like the Chucky films. It's a cute child's doll that is instead murdering people. And so you kind of get that sense of, well, animation is used to, placate children, or it's used to represent the psychological, horrifying dreams of somebody who thinks they're being possessed by a ghost and being inspired to murder themselves, to commit suicide.
I also think it plays into the idea of the fact that he might be having hallucinations and might not be as mentally stable as we have thought previously.
Yeah, for sure. That sequence is so expressionistic and abstract. And I mean, one of my favorite things about that sequence is they cut back to the image of him and Elster talking at the courthouse after they've exonerated Scotty. And in the background of that shot is Carlotta, the specter of a ghost. And like Hitchcock is doing stuff with this abstract imagery that people just weren't doing in 1958 in major Hollywood releases. And I think that's what kind of segues me into like a deeper analysis of this movie, because I found myself 2/3 of the way through the movie saying, why is this movie called Vertigo? Because originally the movie was called From Among the Dead. It was an adaptation of a French novel by the same people who wrote the movie Diabolique, which we will watch at some point. Fantastic movie. But I kept saying, what is the significance of vertigo? Because it's not about his fear of heights, his acrophobia. It's about the dizziness of vertigo. And I wrote down that I think vertigo, his dizziness, is the thing that keeps him from actually protecting Madeline. Like, there's a shortcoming that he has, and that's what he feels this insane sense of guilt about, was that he had a flaw in his character that kept him from being what he felt he needed to be. And when you kind of like pull back on that theme and apply it to the whole film, this is a movie about all of our shortcomings. Like, Hitchcock is pointing out those areas in our lives where we feel insane regret and guilt and obsession over the things that we can't fix from the past because of our shortcomings.
I think it's definitely a movie about how people aren't perfect. And I think one of the themes that plays into that is our perceptions of reality or certain events that we witness. They're not perfect. We might be misinterpreting an event we witness even when we're there in person. And I also think our perceptions of ourselves and others are just really dynamic and open to interpretation by others.
Yeah, I think that there's something really healthy about the past 15 to 20 years of philosophical thought and recognizing, and I guess I'm talking about postmodernism, in recognizing that we are so influenced by our point of view and all of the different things that go into our point of view. And it's not just one or two things. It's who our parents are and what their points of view were and how they influenced us as children. It's about the different teachers that we've had. It's about the different experiences interacting with other cultures than our own. It's about so many different things that shape us. And we see in this movie that Jimmy Stewart acts in certain ways, but his perspective is flawed sometimes. And we don't always know that what he is seeing is real or true. And that can lead to terrible places.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that what Hitchcock is doing here is he's making the argument that you can't pull the good things out of the past without drudging up the ghosts and the skeletons that come along with it. Like, we get these wonderful visual cues in Judy's apartment when she opens her closet door and she still has the gray suit that she wore when she was Madeline. And Jimmy Stewart tells her later in the movie, like, you keeping the necklace is what gave the whole thing away. You can't be sentimental about a killing. And she and Jimmy Stewart are both guilty of romanticizing the past and not thinking that they'll also bring up all of the dark, terrible things that they've done as well.
And I think that leads me to the most important thing that you can take away from this movie is that humans need healthy community around them to deal with the trauma and tragedy that we experience in this world. And there are so many different theories out there about why there's evil in the world and suffering and all of those things. But I think we can all agree that we need healthy ways to deal with the crap that happens in this world. And some people have it worse off than others, but all of our stuff that we deal with is our own stuff and it's meaningful to us. And we need to find healthy ways to deal with the things that happen to us. Otherwise, we could end up, as Hitchcock kind of says, we can all end up like Jimmy Stewart.
So that gets us into our final thoughts and our final scores on this movie. And I've gone back and forth on what I was going to say because I went into this movie thinking, I've seen it a ton of times and maybe I like Rear Window better than this because Rear Window is like a lean and mean suspense movie. And I turned this movie on and the first half hour, like Brad said, was so painfully slow that I thought for sure I have to knock this movie down a couple pegs. And then everything else happened and it switched genres like 3 times and it had me on the edge of my seat and it had me feeling icky as a human being and being unsettled and I couldn't think about anything else the next day. And it made me realize, like, even with that first half hour, I don't think I'd change anything about this movie. It is a singularly unique piece of cinema that no one will ever reproduce. And I have to give this movie a 10 out of 10.
I would definitely give it a 10 out of 10. I think it's a masterpiece. And also, there's just so many things in this movie that were so experimental for the time that you can't not give it a 10 out of 10. And also, it, as you said, Bob, withstands the test of time. I think it's just as creepy now, if not creepier. Will affect me for days, by the way, than it was the first time I saw it years ago.
Yeah, I think that's the thing for me is that I wanted to give it like a 9 or 9.5 out of 10 because of the slowness in that first section where he's following, I wanted to say Carlotta for a second, but when he's following Madeline around when she's supposedly possessed, and that's so slow. But I think that when a movie uses slowness for a purpose, and it builds to something and it has a payoff later in the movie and you can recognize why it was slow in that point, that it's worth it. And so I'm going to go ahead and also give this a 10 out of 10. I can't think of another movie that, as we said at the start, it takes you to places in the human psyche that I have never seen another movie do. And when you look at other suspense films, even more modern ones like Shutter Island, like they do a lot of really interesting and cool things, but never in the way that Hitchcock was able to do. He is truly the master of suspense.
Well, there you have it. These are our thoughts on Vertigo. All 10s across the board. I think it's the first time we've ever had 3 10s on an episode, but we want to hear what you think. So please reach out to us on social media. We are at Film Whiskey on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook, or you could give us a call on our call-in line. The number is 216-800-5923. Once again, you should give us a call at 216-800-5923. Next week, we'll be back for your 4th of July weekend with the 2005 film Cinderella Man. For the Film and Whiskey Podcast, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Jen Lowers.
And I'm Brad G.
We'll see you next time. Yeah, I thought that this murder plot was kind of nonsensical to begin with. Like, you had to have so many things go right to pull this off. And I kind of wonder why he didn't just kill his wife and dump her off the bell tower, like, on his own without recruiting Kim Novak and Jimmy Stewart. Because, like, he could have very easily just passed it off as an accident and still not been implicated in it. Like, why did he have to do this whole elaborate ruse?